Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 55 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with me, Rory Lees-Oakes, and with me is my fellow phenomenologist, Mr. Ken Kelly. How are you doing, Ken?
I'm doing exceptionally well. Glad to be here. Glad of the topic we're looking at today. There's kind of a theme that runs through today's episode of equality, diversity, and we're going to be kicking off and we're going to be speaking about autonomy and independence. We're going to be going into theory with Rory, and you're going to be covering something very dear to my own heart because I did a course on this, as you well know, Rory. In fact, I was given the contact for this course by your good self, and that's the seven-eyed model of supervision. What can we expect to hear from that, Rory?
Well, I think that this is becoming something that's more taught in counselling courses so students understand the kind of supervision that they're liable to get and how it works. And I'm going to be looking at one theory. There's many theories in supervision, but quite a popular one, and it's called the seven-eyed model by Shohet and Hawkins, and it's one that's taught to supervisors, and I think it's a really easy model for students to understand. And if you know the model, it's easier to kind of engage with your supervisor and have a more kind of constructive and collegial relationship, I think.
I like it. And I saw a on a television program, a psychological experiment that was run, Rory, where they had two groups of people. So it was a split test of people watching a film. And to one group of people, they told them what the outcome was, what the twist was at the end of the film. And they didn't tell group A. So they told this to group B. And then afterwards, they measured their enjoyment levels with a questionnaire. And it was interesting to find out that the group that actually knew the outcome actually enjoyed the film more, and you would think it would be the other way around, but that was the outcome of the experiment. And I know that I'm going to enjoy theory with Rory more because I know what's coming because I've looked at that seven-eyed model. So there's my link. And then moving on, we're going to be looking at race and culture, and we're going to be debating that as we go out in today's episode. So definitely that theme of equality, of diversity. And we kick off with a Facebook comment that come in, Rory, that you're going to share with us.
Yeah, so we thank Kari Bragg, who's one of our Facebook members. And if you're thinking, well, what's Rory talking about, Facebook members? Where do I find this Facebook group? Well, if you go to Facebook and just type in Counselling Tutor, remember there's two L's in counselling. We spell it the English, UK, British way. If you type that in, you'll find our Facebook group. Just knock on the door and we'll let you in. And you can join 13,000 probably by the time this goes out. Other members who are interested in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. We have students, we have tutors who pop in and post, and we also have a lot of qualified pracs who come in and just share their practice experience. It's just a fantastic place to hang out. So she writes, "Hi guys, I've just started my intro into counselling and psychotherapy course, and I have a question." Well, fire away, Kari. "I personally value my autonomy and independence very much. That being said, how would you say would be the best way to counsel a woman who comes from a culture where the autonomy and independence of women is not valued, without my own values and biases coming out in that situation?" And then she goes on to say, "P.S. I'm also a woman. Thank you." So, yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because I think through our counselling journey, we're going to meet individuals who come from very different perspectives on what is equality. And I'm not going to speak about being a woman because clearly I'm not a woman, but I can clearly see Kari's concern that seeing a woman seeing a woman who's a client who may not have the same autonomy. I'm kind of guessing that she doesn't want to kind of collude with that. It's a bit of a guess on my part. It's a tricky situation to be in as a therapist. My view is that you can't change the world as a therapist. What you can do is by modelling who you are, clients may very well decide that they want to change who they are, if that makes sense.
It does.
And I think that the tricky part of it is that the reality is that in some cultures, it might not be, the woman might not be able to exercise her full autonomy within the culture she resides in.
100%. What I really like, I think this is such an informed question, I really do. And what I like is that the question says, I don't want my own self, my own biases, my own influences to come out in this. And I think that's the key for me, in that it's about looking to self, because there's evidence out there that there is not equality between men and women, and you can see that in the pay scales, and it's reported in the news, and there is the come on, we need to do something about this, but it's taking decades. This debate has been going on for a very long time, yet it still remains that certainly in the workplace and pay scales there is inequality, and that is external to self. We need to look internally, as the question kind of informs us, who are we, and look at our own culture, our own heritage, our own family, our own background, what has led us to the point we're at, and be mindful that doesn't, I guess, come out in our counselling relationship. Well, I guess it's going to inform our counselling relationship at some level, but us understanding ourselves, we can not bring those biases in, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I can reflect on is that, like a lot of counselling courses, and being a man in a counselling course, I am in a minority, and I'm not complaining about that, but it seems to be a fact that there tends to be more women who train to be counsellors than men, certainly in my experience of being trained and also being a trainer for over a decade. And what I would say, I was surprised about some of the peers on my course, and certainly some of the students who I taught, female students that I taught, women, was that they realised that maybe they didn't have the autonomy they thought they had.
Yeah.
As they went through the arc of the course, they said, actually, I thought I was kind of in an equal world and had equality. And actually, now that I've kind of studied this stuff, I'm beginning to believe that maybe I need to kind of push that along a little bit more.
I think it's an interesting time, and it's a great question. I think it's a question of this time, because if we look back at the roots of talking therapies, they are male dominated. They just are. You've got Freud, you've got it just is how it's gone forward. But today we have some really good, strong female voices coming out in counselling and being heard, and I recognise that as a sign of these times. And I think this is a great question to be asking, something to be debating. And of course, if you want to join in with this debate, you can do so. Rory gave you the link to how to find our Facebook group. Get on the Facebook group and let's get some more out of this conversation, because I don't think this is over, and I think we're still going to be talking about this in 5 years' time, Rory.
I do, and I'll leave you with this little thought. I'm going to give you the name of someone, Laura Pearls. And very few people probably know who Laura Pearls was, but actually she was the wife of Fritz Pearls, who invented Gestalt. It's going to be a lecture I'm going to be giving in a week's time on the basics and principles of Gestalt. But here's the thing: it was her that invented it. Wow. She invented it. They were in South Africa. They'd escaped from the Holocaust. They were people of Jewish heritage, and they'd escaped during the Second World War from the Nazis, and they settled in South Africa. But all the evidence points to the fact that it was actually his wife that invented the therapy, but Fritz kind of took the credit for it. And I'm sure there's going to be lots of Gestaltists out there going, no, that's not true. But if you look at the history, there's a very strong indication. And also in Roger's history as well, there's quite a few female, there's quite a few women in person-centered therapy who never got a mention. Jessie Taft is one of them. Very few people know who Jessie Taft was, but she actually founded the bases of social work practice.
Wow.
And she informed Roger's work when he was at the Rochester Children's School, where he kind of moved away from psychoanalysis to develop person-centered theory. But there you go. Very quiet voices in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. They need to be louder.
Yeah, and I think that those voices are there, and maybe it was as a sign of the times that maybe, as you mentioned with Gestalt, that it came out from the husband rather than the wife. And I wonder if it had been her voice that was heard, whether it would have been taken as seriously at that time in history. It's interesting. What a great debate! What a great question! I really appreciate that.
Yes, thanks, Kari. And if you've got a question you want to asking on the podcast, why don't you just put it into the Facebook page and say, Rory, Rory and Ken, I've got a question here. Any chance you can talk about it in the podcast? And if we can, we will.
We most certainly will. So, moving on, theory with Rory, we're going to be looking at the seven-eyed model of supervision. Now, supervision, I mean, I'm thinking now we kind of specifically while we're studying, there's an ethical obligation to do a certain amount of hours of supervision. So often we hear in the Facebook group conversations, what should I take to supervision? How should I use supervision? And I think understanding the different models of supervision can kind of inform what a supervisor might be looking at, where a supervisor may look, and it can kind of inform what we might take in, Rory.
Absolutely. It's about having a common language and about being able to understand where your supervisor's coming from, where you're coming from, to be able to work more kind of collegially, in a better cooperation. And it might surprise some people, but supervision's a relatively new profession. I can remember in the 80s talking to a therapist and never went to supervision. They had what they called the co-counselling movement, where they would take their casework to a peer and talk it through. And it's only really since the 1980s, middle 80s, where supervision has become a discipline within counselling and psychotherapy. Can you believe that, Ken?
It's interesting, and you know, the BACP ethical framework was updated just last year at the time of us making this podcast, and we have got those requirements for a student counsellor with regard to supervision. But if you look at a qualified counsellor and the requirements for supervision, it suggests regularly. But I guess you've got to take what regularly means to you. So still, it's a little flimsy, and it's just interesting because I just find supervision so very beneficial to myself.
Yeah, it's super important, and you know, I've had supervision. I've had multiple supervisions in a month because I had an issue that I needed to talk through. It is tricky because, of course, for a lot of people, you have to pay for it. But yeah, you can't underestimate supervision. And I gave a lecture on this recently in the CSR, the Counselling Study Resource, where I talked about supervision, and I just gave it really, really in depth for those students who are just starting on their journeys. And it was quite well attended, I think, Ken.
It was indeed, as I'm sure this podcast and this Theory with Rory will be well downloaded because it is an interesting topic. So without any further ado, it is Theory with Rory.
Counselling Theory with Rory Lees-Oakes.
Ask any student of counselling and psychotherapy the importance of supervision, and they will tell you it's an ethical requirement that offers protection to the client, is also asked of awarding bodies, and it's a activity that they have to engage in through the arc of training and well into their professional lives. In other words, supervision is a part of counselling and psychotherapy in general. But ask them what models their supervisor uses, and you may get a different answer. And the reason for this is, generally speaking, supervision models are not taught in a lot of level 4 and level 5 courses. And the reason for that is the syllabus asks students to learn about the models of counselling and psychotherapy, not particularly about them being trained as supervisors. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one model that is used a lot. I use it in my practice a lot, and it's by Peter Hawkins and Robin Shohet, called the seven-eyed model of supervision. And Shohet and Hawkins are famous for another reason. In 2006, they wrote a best-selling book called Supervision in the Helping Professions. And that book is really a standard book for supervisors the world over. I know I've got a copy. I know Ken's got a copy in his bookshelf. And everybody who I know who supervises has a copy of it. It's such a popular book. And the model I'm going to talk to you about is actually used not only in the world of counselling and psychotherapy, it's used in things like support work and also in social work and coaching. So the seven-eyed model is widely used in a number of different helping professions. And indeed, the book, Supervision in the Helping Professions, gives you a clue that the model really wasn't designed just for counselling and psychotherapy. So, as the model suggested, there's 7 eyes. And the way to think about this is 7 ways of looking at the client presentation, the supervisory relationship, and indeed how the supervisee is working with the client. So I'm going to give you a little overview of those models, and maybe you can recognise your supervisor using it in their practice. So the first I is called the focus on the client, and basically it's the supervisor asking the supervisee about the client. And the reason this process is undertaken is quite simply to highlight the fact that they're bringing a real person to supervision. They're bringing people's material, their lives to supervision, and that it should be dealt with in a way that doesn't see the client as a set of problems or maybe a set of processes or a set of interventions. It acknowledges right from the beginning that you're dealing with a real person and a real person's life. Now, in I2 of the seven-eyed model, we talk about the focus of intervention. Now, a lot of you who'll be listening will be person-centered therapists, and you'll say, well, I don't do any interventions. I'm a person-centered therapist. And my response to that is yes and no. And the reason for the no is that anything that you do where you're working with the client, asking a question, maybe a little bit of challenge, could be supporting or giving some information, is classed as an intervention. So it's the focus on the intervention, and there's different interventions in different therapies. So if we're looking at transactional analysis, they'd also be talking about ego states, script matrix, that type of thing. And in CBT, it would be action, belief and consequence, and maybe looking at beliefs generated from activated events or faulty thinking. So in this I2, the idea is the supervisor is listening for the kind of interventions the supervisee is using and trying to get a sense of why they're being used, what's the motivation. And also it can be a time where both the supervisor and the supervisee brainstorm, have a think about different alternatives. It's well worth remembering that, like the ballroom dancer, the supervisor has kind of been on this journey a little longer, knows a little bit more client hours under the belt. So at this point, the supervisees kind of drawing from their experience. But be aware, this isn't about the supervisor saying, this is what you must do. This is around suggestions and a mutual understanding. Now, in I3 of the model, the focus is on the client-supervisee relationship. So as a supervisor, this is a little bit like me being a therapeutic CCTV camera in the room. Although I'm not present when the client and my supervisee are practicing, what I'm trying to get a sense of is what the relationship is like. And I'm trying to get the perspectives of both the client and the supervisee. And I'm interested in the relationship, the therapeutic relationship that's being formed between these two individuals. Sometimes I'll ask a supervisee for a metaphor or a word that sums up the relationship. This gives me a clue to where the relationship is and gives rise for further exploration. So I'll ask a supervisee, think of something that signifies a relationship. You might say a rock. And I might go on and say, tell me a little bit what a rock means to you. It's a good way of exploring. There's also another space that we need to investigate. And that, of course, is my favourite, which is transference and counter-transference. Now, in this eye of the model, I'm looking for any kind of issues on transference. And I'm also interested in getting a real sense from my supervisee of how they are in the relationship. So there are some questions to ask. And anybody who's been a supervisee of mine or a student of mine will recognise this question. I usually say to my supervisees, if you're on a train with this client, if you're travelling from London to Manchester, tell me, and the train wasn't going to stop and you were the only people on the train, would you choose to sit next to the client? And by the reaction of the supervisee, that can open up a whole kind of line of exploration. I get a client who says, a supervisee who says, oh yes, I'd love to sit next to this person. I'm interested in why that is and any transferences. So, do they remind the supervisee of anyone? What is the relationship that's being built up between the supervisee and the client? It can give a lot of depth and a lot of shared understanding, in my view, of what goes on
in the relationship in the room. I'm also interested in countertransference. So it might be that the client is reacting in a way that you're not quite sure about. And that does happen. And it might be that the client is reacting to your transference. So I'll give you an example. A client who says very timidly, "Is it all right if I put my cup on the table?" And the therapist or my supervisee says, "Oh, of course it is. That's what it's there for." Could be that in that slight arc of time, what happens is the client goes into a child place and the therapist goes into a kind of parent place, and it unbalances the relationship. And from there on in, the client comes from like a very much a child place. And that can have the effect of the therapist acting like a parent, and back and forth it goes. So if I can see that in a relationship, there's a chance to counterbalance it and perhaps help the supervisee back to the adult. I'll give you an example from my teaching a few years ago, and it is a good few years ago. I had a student who was terrified. The word terrified was used of a client who was not a terrifying person by all accounts, didn't do anything either, covertly or overtly to frighten her, but she was scared of him. And she'd taken it to supervision. She couldn't get a handle on it whatsoever. So as a consequence, she brought it to a case discussion meeting. And we were chatting generally about things that we look for transference, such as, is it someone that you knew? Is it someone the client looked like someone, talk like someone, sound like somebody, wears the same clothes, had the same height, anything? And there's nothing at all. And then I just said, what does the client smell like? And I remember the person sitting bolt upright in the chair and going, that's it. And the client used a deodorant, and the smell reminded my learner, student, of someone who wasn't very nice in their past. And that's a bit of an understatement. And what happened is she'd gone into transference. She'd subconsciously seen him as this really horrible person. And what was happening was that then she was projecting that onto the client. Subconsciously, she wasn't actively being nasty to them, but she was withdrawing from the relationship. And as a consequence of that, the client was wanting more, became a bit unbalanced. So once we looked at that and acknowledged it, then she could be more open in the relationship. And as a consequence of that, the client could be more open in the relationship. So that's the supervision side, looking at transference and counter-transference. In I4, the focus is on the supervisee, and I'm really kind of looking about how the supervisee is emotionally coping with the work, and also any kind of parallel process. So there are two types of parallel process, and I'm going to speak about one that's in this particular eye of the model, and that is where the supervisee is kind of gets stuck because her and the client are going through the same process. And this can sometimes happen where a client is going through a divorce and the supervisee is going through a divorce. And they come to a place where the supervisee can't separate their own emotions from the client's. Becomes very murky, comes with a bit of a transferential mire. And also thinking about any kind of pressures that the client might be putting on to the therapist. So in terms of, clients sometimes say, well, you're going to cure me. And I've told everybody that once I've seen you, I'm going to be fine again. No pressure there, really, is there? So that's the kind of focus on the supervisee. And also, I'll be looking out maybe if I heard that the supervisee wanted to change the client for their own reasons rather than the client's. So this is very much on the supervisee's own process, me focusing on that. I7, focus on the wider context. So the wider context is anything that extends outside the therapy room. And I'll just give you a bit of a list. So in terms of counsellors and supervisees and supervisors, that's going to be ethics, the law, policies and procedures of organisations, be that the supervisee's organisation, their placement, or the supervisor's organisation. Yeah. So wider context. It's also going to be things like the modality of therapy that a supervisee practices. There may be a recognition that another form of therapy may be better, and we have to see that in a wider context. But also the client's surrounded by a wider context. And those things can be culture, where people live, ability. Is someone a wheelchair user? Is someone got a disability? Is someone's first language not English? That's a wider context. How about culture? People come from different cultures and have different experiences. That's a wider context. And part of the context of supervision is recognising that, and also biases that can exist, and being thoughtful to kind of point the supervisee in a direction where I say, well, maybe what's happening to the client is that because of what's happening in the wider context. I'll give you an example. A good example is a client who continues to DNA but wants to come back. And it might be that someone's on benefits and can't afford the bus fare that week to go to the centre. That's a wider context. So those are the things that have to be explored. And it might be the supervisor gets frustrated. We never turn up. I'm waiting for them, they never turn up. But the wider context is, after a little exploration, is that they just can't afford the bus fare. And I've known that happen a few times when I was a student. So I hope that's been a useful exploration of the seven-eyed model. And now that you've got a kind of overview of it, maybe you've got the steps of the dancing that you and your supervisor do.
Thank you very much, Rory. It's just so interesting just to hear that again. And as you well know, I'm a supervisor, as you are a supervisor, Rory, and my training was in the seven-eyed model. But it's just good to revisit it from time to time. And it's amazing all the different domains, the different areas that we look at in the supervision process, and what we can be aware of when we take our own practice to supervision, what areas we can be looking at there. And of course, if you want to get Rory's handout, which overviews, I guess, not overlays, overviews the seven-eyed model of supervision. You can get that by going to counsellingtutor.com, 2 L's in counselling. That's our mother website. Click on the podcasts tab, go to episode number 55, and all the show notes are there, and the download is right there. You just pop in your email address and it'll be sent right through to you. If you are a member of the Handouts Vault, which is part of the Counselling Study resource, you can just pop into the Handouts Vault, and that has already been added for you in the Handouts Vault. So, moving from theory back to equality and diversity, and we're going to be speaking about race and culture, Rory.
Well, we're very grateful to Julie Jackson, and Julie has posted on our Facebook page, "Hi, does anyone know of any good books or resources out there about diversity and cultural heritage?" Well, yeah, a good resource is the Counselling Tutor Podcast, because we're going to look at that today. We're going to talk about race and culture. And I'll ask you a question out there. Ken knows the answer to this, but if I ask you a question out there, what is race? Just take a few moments to have a think about the word race. And it's interesting because race actually comes from the French word family. Did you know that, Ken?
I didn't, no.
No, it comes from the word family, which means a grouping of people. And it's an artificially constructed idea done by kind of the Europeans in the 17th and 18th century, and it was a taxonomy. And if you want to know what a taxonomy is, if you go to your local museum, you will find lots of kind of artifacts in shelves, and those are put in taxonomies. They're kind of put in chapters, like a book. So you can say, this is this, this is this, this is that. And bearing in mind, that's how originally in the history, certainly in European history, people were classified by what they look like, their skin colour. And one of the people who did this was someone called Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. And I'm going to tell you what he wrote. Now, bearing in mind that basically this is kind of thing was prevalent in the 17th century, not acceptable today at any level, but he broke people down into these categories. Okay, and some of these are quite hard to hear, I have to say. Quite hard to say, if I'm honest. Caucasian or the white race, Mongolian or the yellow race, including East Asians and some Central Asians, Malaysian or the brown race, including Southeastern Asians and Pacific Islanders, Ethiopian or the black race, including sub-Saharan Africans, and American or the red race, including American Indians. Now, nowadays, that would be a totally unacceptable way of categorizing people, wouldn't it?
It definitely. I mean, you're basically putting a label on somebody, and a really simplistic color label as well, not looking at the depth of the person themselves, but seeing an outside appearance.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we talk of race, I mean, up till the Equality Act in 2010, there was no legal definition of race. There was no legal definition. I'm not quite sure if there is a legal definition in the UK still, because it's basically, and I'm going to be honest, it's a nonsense. It's a taxonomy. It's a way of labelling people, and it's kind of goes back hundreds of years. We now really talk about culture, and people's culture, and culture is a completely different thing. So to finish off on race, yes, we can find out where people's heritage originated from. You can go and get yourself a DNA test and discover that your ancestors may have come from, I don't know, France, Germany, Ethiopia, Australia, etc., etc. But a race as a construct really is pretty redundant. Culture, however, is what we inherit from our ancestors, and then how we build that into our lives. And sometimes we can get culture and how we look can be confusing. And I'm going to share something about my life, about how people get really confused with something really, really simple. Christmas dinner, Ken. I go, and my family every year go, and we have a curry for Christmas dinner. On the 25th of December, we sit down to a splendid feast of spicy delights.
Why not indeed?
But if I tell people that, people sometimes looked astonished. They say, really? Don't you have like a turkey and sprouts? And no, we don't do that. We go and have a curry. And that's culture. That's our family's culture. Yeah, our family's culture. And culture can have many aspects. It can be our faith position. It could be the way we live our lives. It could be social constructs, like as we spoke about earlier in the podcast, about women's roles in certain societies. It's very, very wide. So that is the difference between race and culture. And those are the facts, Ken.
I like them. And as you were speaking about race, I was thinking of an anthropologist. He studied anthropology at Witwatersrand University in Southern Africa, and his name is Johnny Clegg. And he left becoming a lecturer to become a pop star. And he's very well known in South Africa. And he's just actually finished, at the time of making this recording, a world tour. And one of his songs is called The Scatterlings of Africa. And the song is written about, if you trace it back far enough, it doesn't go to Europe or Germany. It all goes back to Africa. There is one root. And that's the interesting thing. We all started in the same place, and through evolution changed in appearance and the way that our bodies adapted because of the environments that we lived in. But at the core, all the same. And when you're relating that to culture, I've got a really nice handout that we'll put in the show notes. So if you want this handout, it's counsellingtutor.com, podcast tab, episode number 55, and it's called The Iceberg Concept of Culture. And it outlines what culture is, but it also mentions that you've got the primary culture, which is that part of culture that is in our awareness, and then you've got the out of awareness culture, so that we're influenced. So in awareness, you've mentioned some of them, Rory, might be your fine arts, the literature of your culture, the drama, the classical music, the popular music of this day, folk dancing, games, cookings, dress, and then out of awareness, kind of that still influences who we are culturally, notions of modesty, conceptions of what beauty is, vary from culture to culture. So this is a really interesting document to inform self. I found it really interesting. So we'll pop that in the show notes of today. Yeah.
So, have a listen to this again. There's quite a lot of information in this podcast, but it is really useful. And what I would say, one real plea is, if someone's heritage does come up, don't shy away from it. I think there can be a tendency for people to think, I might offend somebody. But I think that if you come from a place of honesty and inquiry and be very kind of respectful, then most people will respond to that. And I will give you an example. I used to work as a support worker near Prestwich, which is a large Jewish area, and there they have a shop that sells bagels, and I'm not trying to stereotype Jewish people, but I used to go and get my bagels. They were the best. State Fair, if you're ever in Prestwich, buy State Fair bagels, they're the best. And I was looking at some of the food, I had no idea, and I just picked the food up and I just asked somebody, and I just said to them, excuse me, I said, can you tell me how you'd use that? And the person told me it was respectful interchange. I learned something about their culture, the Jewish person's culture, which was really invaluable. But it's all about being respectful. That's what I would say. And we're all human at the end of the day.
Like it. What a great episode as well. And it's kind of culture, diversity, heritage has woven its way through today's episode. We kicked off speaking about autonomy and independence. Then we went on to theory with Rory with the seven-eyed model of supervision. And of course, ending off with race, culture and heritage. A little bit of a debate there with some great information, definition, and of course the handouts that go. What a lovely episode, Rory.
Yeah, and it is, culture and talking about diversity can feel quite uncomfortable for a new counsellor. And if I'm really honest, even going through the podcast here, I'd had to think very carefully about what I said. So I guess it affects us all, Ken.
Indeed, it does. Well, that brings us to the end of episode number 55. Been good being here. Can't wait for next week.
Yeah, and as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
If you enjoy the topics and handouts here on the Counselling Tutor Podcast, then you will love the Counselling Study Resource. CSR was built by myself, Ken, and Rory Leesoaks to give you the support you need during your counselling studies. So get access to the world's most comprehensive collection of resources aimed at supporting you in your journey to become a counsellor. Take the stress out of your studies by visiting counsellingtutor.com/CSR. That's counsellingtutor.com/CSR.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.